I was in a treatment cult, which was an outpatient treatment center that was run by a mother-daughter therapist team. But once people were better, they would either become a therapist there or find other ways to be given positions of authority. There were two women who ran businesses which employed clients. One was landscaping, and the other was elderly companionship care. Others would house newer members into their homes and would be paid rent by the treatment center. The whole therapy was based off the 12-step program. Everyone was required to attend the same 6:30 a.m. AA meeting. These meetings were about 95% people from the treatment center. Even if alcohol wasn't their drug or addiction of choice, everyone had to have a sponsor, and they had better be clients of the treatment center so they can better keep tabs on you. You also needed to call your sponsor plus 3 other support people each day to let them know how you're doing. I was never very good at expressing my emotions, so these calls, which I rarely made, were basically recaps of what happened to me that day. Newer clients had to attend 3 group therapy sessions each week, and these sessions consisted of conflict resolution, i.e. public shaming. If you weren't following the long, ever-changing list of rules, you were made to feel ashamed in front of 20 to 30 people. Many times, people were told that they were going to end up back on drugs or whatever brought them to seek help. Pretty much all clients also attended 1 weekly individual session. Whatever you talked about would then be fair game to be brought up in group sessions later. After I left, I read about several complaints made to the state of Florida regarding this, as it was a clear violation of HIPAA laws. Anyway, on to some messed up stories. When my grandfather died, I was already in trouble for never making calls to my sponsor or my other support people. The therapist made me call my parents and tell them that I needed someone to come up from Florida to Philadelphia with me for support, or they'd tell them that I couldn't go because I was in a bad spot. I should mention here that my parents started out fairly skeptical of this place, but soon began drinking the Kool-Aid as I had done. My parents had to pay for this person to fly up with me at the last minute. They were pretty upset about this, but didn't know how I was forced until I told them about it later. 2 friends that were clients were seeing each other in secret, as any romantic relationships were heavily controlled and scrutinized. They were given the option to either end things or leave. They both chose to leave. This was hard on a lot of people, as one of my friends had been there since he was a child, as his parents joined the cult when he was very young. I decided one day that I had had enough and was going to leave. I was in an odd situation, in that I was renting an apartment and had 2 newer people living with me. I was also employed at the landscaping company, and knew that my employment was conditional that I be a client of the treatment center. My roommates were going to go that weekend on a monthly weekend program, which is just intensive group therapy for 3 days. The therapists had wanted me to do it again because I wasn't doing well in their eyes, and I said that I was going to get there after attending a 12-step meeting with some other people in the program. We got to where the meeting was held, and I said I had to use the bathroom and would be in soon. I waited in the bathroom for a few minutes, and then took off. I didn't want to go back to Baltimore, where I am originally from, as I was under a lease for my apartment. I turned off my phone, went to a movie theatre about half-hour away, and watched Grindhouse. When the movie was over, I took my time going back to my apartment, and arrived shortly after 1 a.m. I was just sitting around trying to figure out what I was going to do, when there was a loud, authoritative knock on the door. I'd made sure to leave off all my lights, so I just sat there hoping they would go away. The knocking continued every minute or so, and then I saw a cop shining a flashlight in the windows. I hit the floor and stayed there for several more minutes before deciding to get up and open the door. There were 2 cops, my primary therapist, and a friend from the treatment center. The therapist had told the police that I was likely to hurt myself, and I was basically given the choice of going back to the treatment center or going to the psych ward for 72 hours. I decided to go back to the treatment center, where I ended up becoming a second-class citizen again, like new members and other relapsers. I stayed for several more months until I got a normal job and my roommate was kicked out of the treatment center. Other clients and even the therapists were giving me a hard time for allowing him to continue to live with me, so I just stopped showing up to the group sessions and the morning AA meetings. Because I stopped showing up, my primary therapist called my mother and told her and my father that they needed to come down for an intervention because I was suicidal. My mother thanked her for her concern and hung up the phone. After leaving, none of my friends who were still clients were allowed to talk to me. This was pretty par for the course, and there were plenty of others who had left recently, so I was able to stay in touch with them. It was still an incredibly difficult transition, which caused me to be depressed for several months. This place had a rather lengthy thread on a cult awareness forum that was full of former clients retelling horror stories. Eventually, the mother therapist passed away, and a lot of the older members left. I did hear that a male therapist was hired, who then got a newer recovering alcoholic drunk and then slept with her. My cousin is still involved in Scientology. She lives inside of SEA.org while working for them. She has been a secretary there for over 7 years and is in her early 20s. Her mother cannot talk to her or send letters to her without it being intercepted and discussed on the grounds of how it will affect her focus on the greater good of her being. Once in a rare while, my aunt will call and get her daughter at the desk and just have enough time to say, "I love you." Now, my said cousin's father is heavily involved, and has been since the early days of its establishment. My mum remembers the day he joined in California. A car drove up beside him as he was walking down the street, and a woman got out and said, "Do you have any real friends? Are you happy with yourself as a person? You seem lonely." She handed him a pamphlet, and he went to the church that same day. He was then audited to see what level of thetan he was. Look this shit up, it's crazy. He once told my mum, whom had just cut herself while working at a frame shop together, to go and try to cut herself again. His reasoning? No two same things can happen in this world. He also told my mum that he and other members of the church were going to make this guy's life a living hell for leaving. They would find out whenever he got a new job and relentlessly call him all day from different numbers. They even went as far to write complaints. My uncle also has said that having a child is a bad act that oppresses your spirit, and that conceiving is to allow an evil thetan to trick your good thetan over into the world we live in now. He explained this is why most adopt in Scientology or join after having children, because their thetan level is so strong it led them to stop their children from doing so. Yet, he has kids after converting. It's incredibly sad, and I wish I was making this up. I was raised by Jehovah's Witnesses. They're certainly not a cult in the Jonestown sense of the word. but they're a lot more controlling than your typical church. They're obsessed with the idea that their faith is the only one true religion. Members refer to the religion as the truth, and that the apocalypse is imminent. Jehovah's Witnesses basically live with an us against them view of the world, where they imagine that they're the only good people and that the rest of us are all ruled by the devil. They go preaching to try and save the few good people from this satanic world. I left simply because the doctrines didn't make sense to me, and I'm not sure if any single event stands out as especially bizarre, but there's a lot about their faith that's not quite normal. They have a pseudo-legal system that investigates and punishes members for breaking rules like no sex outside of marriage, no smoking, no blood transfusions. They even have a rule that states you're not allowed to divorce and remarry unless your spouse dies or cheats on you. So if a Jehovah's Witness married couple get divorced, it's basically a standoff to see who starts a new relationship first and gets shunned for it, and the other will be free to remarry. The sins that you are defellowshipped for, which is the official term for being shunned, are many, including sexual misconduct of any kind. This includes watching hardcore porn, and used to include oral and anal between married couple, celebrating holidays, voting, or expressing political affiliation, smoking, illegal drug use, and a whole handful of other things. There are countless other things, like swearing, masturbation, R-rated movies, that aren't as punishable, but are still considered wrong, and the religion exerts as much influence on your life as possible by expecting you to read church literature and attend meetings several times a week. The religion also has a tendency to produce really sheltered children. I know a lot of Jehovah's Witness kids who've been homeschooled and basically have no clue how the real world works. For the most part, they tend to just get part-time jobs and devote the rest of their life to door-to-door preaching. Even kids who didn't get homeschooled end up having a hard time at school because you can't stand for the national anthem, participate in any holiday-related stuff in class, and you're discouraged from joining clubs or sports teams, or really having friends outside the religion at all. My parents were going through a separation, and they dumped me off with a family friend for almost a year. I was about 8 or 9. Turns out the lady was part of a cult. It was just a big house at the end of the road outside a city. There were maybe 8 of us kids, and 12 adults. The boys all slept in the same room. One of them was older and would make the other boys do odd sexual things. No touching was ever involved, but it would be like roll around on the floor naked, grind against this pillow, weird stuff like that. We would only eat peanut butter sandwiches, butter pasta, and rice, and we would wake up every morning at 4 a.m. to clean the house. Anyway, we would clean all morning, then learn everything through the lens of Christianity. It would consist of Bible stories and how science lies to us. There was no real learning, but rather God or Jesus was the answer for everything. So like, what causes rain? God causes rain. I would frequently get in trouble because I would constantly and loudly question much of what they taught. Actually, it was because I would watch Star Trek when I was younger, and the science they preached was more fictitious than the science on a TV show. I would be punished for questioning about Moses and Noah's Ark. They would lock me in this small closet, and all I would do is sleep. In fact, I remember hating it there so much that their punishments only made me want to be more logical and challenge all of their weird teachings. It was the only place I could get away from all of them and actually sleep. Things were starting to get worse. They would yell at me and stopped feeding me. I managed to run away a few times by climbing a storage shed and jumping over the fence. But somehow, they always found me, or an officer would bring me back. Then, just one day, my mum showed up and took me home. Years later, they refused to acknowledge that it was a cult. In fact, I didn't realize it was a cult until I was in my 20s. The Bible stories they told were slightly different, so for years I thought things that aren't even in the Bible to be Christian canon. Last I heard, the older boy who would do weird sexual stuff committed suicide. And the one girl who I became friends with is now one of the cult leaders. I was born into a Latter-day Saints Mormon family. I figured out that God and lateral gods are all indistinguishable from fantasy. Then I started learning about anti-Mormon propaganda, aka reality. Like that Joseph Smith Jr. was a convicted conman and sexual predator, and a paedophile. I learned that he couldn't keep his first vision of the story straight, that magic rocks in the hat to translate the plates, and his conman conviction was from tricking people into believing he could use his magic rocks to find buried treasure. I also learnt that the modern-day leaders of the Latter-day Saints Church lied about being lay clergy. Turns out they get paid over $120,000 a year, plus expenses. I also learnt that they bring in over $5 billion in charitable contributions, but according to them, they only spend about $40 million helping people. If you work that out, that's less than 1%. If you can't tell, I have an issue with liars. As for my personal life, I'm married, with kids. My wife has a hard time talking about any of the problems with Latter-day Saints Church, let alone Mormonism. If it could be construed as talking bad about the church, she doesn't want to talk about it. Though I have gotten her to just talk a little bit about the movement, to end the predatory practice of child sexual worthiness interviews. I suspect things would be a little different with my family if my father was able to put his 2 cents in. But he is literally on his deathbed and barely responded. As things are, I am about to speak somewhat openly with my immediate family, but I only do when they try and push me for validity, or how wonderful their beliefs are, or when they're hero-worshipping the Latter-day Saints Church for all its great works, or the current prophets or Joseph Smith. All in all, not nearly as bad as all of my fellow ex-Mormons. One day, the morning of going to said cult, my mother woke me up and tried to force dress me, since I didn't feel like going. I had only gotten a few hours of sleep the night before, and I also felt slightly ill, like I had a cold, so I really wanted to stay home. After a few minutes of struggling to put ugly clothes on me, she gave up, and slapped me approximately 7 times, tried choking me, and shoved me off the bed onto the floor. She screamed at me that I would be in trouble for this rebellion, and left for the cult meeting. That's when I finally decided I had enough, and decided to leave it permanently. I had already been thinking about leaving it, but this was just the final nail in the coffin. Later on, she got me a therapist for the purposes of trying to make me go to their cult meetings, crying that there was something wrong with her daughter. Lucky me, the therapist sided against her and told her to stop forcing me to go. Thankfully, she never did it again, though she lamented about me not believing anymore. This was about 7 years ago, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. In a way, it was sort of a good thing, because it opened my eyes to the world. I was sent to a cult when I was only 12 years old. My parents thought the place was a sort of religious detention camp for troubled teens. I had been bullied at school, but I didn't tell my parents since they were very strict and emotionally abusive. Anyway, they fed us donated and often expired food. They would tell us to just cut off the moldy parts when we worked in the kitchen. Everyone would always be doing some kind of work, whether it be in the kitchen, cleaning the various dorms, caring for the barn animals. I can mention that they killed 2 horses because they couldn't afford to feed them anymore, or other tasks. If they couldn't think of a job for you to do, or if you got in trouble, they would make you haul wood in a circle for 2 hours, or up to the whole day. I hardly slept at all, since I had nightmares and anxiety the whole time. Eventually, the sleep deprivation, exhaustion and depression and anxiety were enough, and they caught me scratching my wrists with a bent paperclip. I could barely draw blood. They told me I could either repent and face punishment, or my parents could pick me up and take me to the psych ward at the hospital, a few towns over. Well, I chose to get the hell out of there. They told me I made the wrong decision, and told me all kinds of religious threats. My parents yelled at me the whole way to the hospital, saying I'd messed up my life and that I was a disappointment and whatnot. During my psychiatric evaluation, I answered all the doctor's questions and whatnot, and she told me that I was not one of the first ones from the Freedom Village to show up there at the hospital, and she told me and my parents that there was absolutely nothing wrong with me, and that I could go home and back to school, and resume my pre-cult life, so to speak. Several years later, my mother is still donating money to this hellhole I escaped from, and I mustered up the courage to speak about it. I told her the place was an evil brainwashing cult, and she didn't believe me. She actually thought the place helped me, because when I came home I didn't act out anymore. I shut my mouth, went to school and church, and came home, grateful to sleep in a warm bed and eat food that was not rotten. Confession time. I am an ex-cult leader. Now I know what you're thinking. You're far too handsome to have ever been a cult leader. Well, while I do find that very flattering, that's just not true. I amassed a smallish following sometime in 2011. Here's a bit of background. I always thought that the truly successful people in life weren't the people who could do anything, but instead were the people who could make other people do anything. So I studied actors, televangelists, all that stuff. Hell, I was an altar boy so that I could just observe the local preacher. Nowadays, I work as a consultant against people who are like me. I pulled together a bullshit detection kit to use against people that were like me. It's not definitive, but it can give you a rough idea as to what you're working with. I'm gonna ask a series of questions. If you answer yes to any of these questions, I heavily recommend getting out as quickly as you can. Number 1. Are you being isolated? You see, cults work on a sort of family dynamic. Isolation gives birth to dependence. Often, we'd start you out with a warm welcome and gradually step back until we were icy. If you learn self-hatred, you learn to work for approval. Number 2. Does the leader have special powers? Let's take King Jong-il's birth. It was heralded by a swallow and a double rainbow. Peter Popoff had healing powers. David Koresh was Jesus. People believe in things that exhibit the qualities that they want. Number 3. Do they recruit people who are alone in some way? The poor, the starving, drug addicted or depressed are great for this. This goes back to nurturing dependency. There is a very real fear of falling back into the old ways the moment that you leave your support system. It also gives people like us a handle to grab on and to manipulate you with. Number 4. Are your clothes, habits, or hobbies being taken away from you? You see, grinding away identity is a core aspect of ownership. To reduce dissent, it's good to make sure you're sticking with all the symbols of the group. Number 5. Do they exhibit an us versus them mentality? Comparing and contrasting helps shape and solidify identity. It also lets you call people into question. The ability to turn on and out other members for approval. It's a strong motivator. Number 6. Were you told that you're special? This works mostly in the starting stages. Everyone wants to be a hero in their own story. After that, it's all ego depletion. Number 7. Do they shun people who abandon the church? This builds on shame, paranoia, and dependency for the people who are still on the inside. I'm sure at this point, you're detecting a pattern here. Find someone lonely. Tell them that they're special and loved. Introduce them to a support system which will shower them in affection. Nurture dependency. Gradually rub away at their ego and sense of self-worth. Rebuild their identity as a member of the cult. Use shame, guilt, and paranoia as a hook to pull them with. In closing, the thing about people who join cults is that they aren't stupid. They're desperate, sad, and afraid. Sure, but they're not stupid. The dangerous thing about smart people is that they can start drinking their own Kool-Aid. Not as many people can rebuke them, and they don't take kindly to hearing the word no. I was born into a cult. It doesn't seem strange when you grow up in it. Even after I left, it took years to realize how very screwed up it all was. They believed in free love. You were married to Jesus. Spouses slept around freely. Girls as young as 14 were seen as old enough. On the surface, they told everyone 16 was the age you could consent. But kid diddlers flocked to sex cults, and the one I grew up in was no exception. My parents are good people. Most people in the group are good people, but they are incredibly naive. They believed the stories of underage kids being molested were lies, spread about by our enemies. I left when I moved to another country. I was a coward and didn't want to make a big deal of leaving. I didn't want to cause a scene with my parents. I told them I was moving to a country/state where everyone was Christian, and I wasn't really a person to be going around trying to convert people. To this day, I still haven't told them how the older boys molested me, how I hate hugs now because I would be forced to hug creepy uncles for far too long, how my younger sister confided in me that she was molested by one of the creepy uncles. I'm extra vague if people ask me where and how I grew up. No one in my current life beyond my husband knows about how I grew up. It's my dirty secret. The cult dissolved when the leader died. My parents are no longer in it, and I've buried it with my past. Other members are extremely bitter, and I don't want to turn out like them. There's no point looking to the past. I've made a new future now, with my children, and I am happy. I was a member of a discipleship program. It was a 13-month minimum Pentecostal reformative center. Basically, this program was in the middle of Arkansas, and I was one of 35 students there. It was in the Women's Center. Every morning, we would wake up at 5:30 to pray. We would all go to the basement and sit on our knees facing the backs of the chairs and pray out loud for everyone else to hear every morning. They had leaders walk around the room and made sure everyone was praying. If you didn't pray out loud or fell asleep, you were punished. After that, we all ate communal breakfast, read proverbs, and did chores around the center until 9:30. We would then either go to the shop or down to the classroom. In the classroom, we did Bible studies and practical applications of biblical principles to our lives. The shop was much better. We would make crosses and plaques and other knickknacks which we would sell to fund the ministry. It was a free program, so we would stand outside of Walmart's with our crafts table, taking donations and selling our handmade wares, much like gypsies. After we were done with our daily tasks, we would eat dinner and take showers. Weekday, lights out was at 10 p.m. We could only talk to our families once every week, for 10 minutes at a time. The leaders who would listen to our phone conversations, and if we said anything that the ministry deemed unwholesome, the phone call was terminated and you lost the right to speak to your family indefinitely. Every aspect of life was regimented. You were never by yourself, unless you were using the bathroom or showering. If you broke one of the rules, like blaspheming the Holy Spirit for one, or questioning authority, you were put on discipline. Discipline lasted between 2 weeks to 3 months, depending on the infraction. You ate last, getting the leftovers once everyone else was done. You couldn't speak to your family at all, and you had to work out in the shop for long periods of time. And this was bad because there was no running water nor toilet, just a bucket. You had extra pray time and had more scriptures to memorize. They didn't allow you to take medicine or go to the doctor. If you got sick, it was because you allowed the devil into your body, and the only way to fix that was through prayer. I was put on discipline a lot when I first came into the program. Being 19, I was one of the youngest girls there, and coming from a non-Pentecostal religious upbringing, I was shocked and scared by the environment. I couldn't tell my family, however, and they wouldn't have believed me, even if I could tell them the sort of environment I was in. I came in on March 10th, 2009, and after 4 months of being pretty much on constant discipline, I resigned myself to my fate and started buckling in. I was a good fundraiser. I usually brought in around $1,000 to the ministry every weekend. The program claimed to show no favoritism to the students who brought in the most money, but that was not the case. Being the youngest and having all of my teeth meant they brought me with them to various churches and other sponsorship opportunities. The pastors used me as an example to people they were trying to get to give us money, as representation of how beautiful the love of God could make people. I was one of the favoured students, and they began letting me watch a little TV, talk to my family more, and take me out to get food occasionally. Along with fundraising, they decided to open up a diner. They hired the program director's daughter's baby daddy as the main chef because he used to work in the kitchens in prison. His name was Jay. He was not a good man. They only sent the good students to the diner, the ones who had been there the longest. There were about 7 of us, going there every day. working in the kitchens and running the cash register. He was young and really good looking and charismatic, and he started flirting with all of us, and everyone loved the attention. We weren't allowed to talk to men, so it was nice to be able to talk to a man without being written up about it. He had total authority over us, while we were there every day. And soon, he started taking advantage of his ability to punish us. He started going a lot further with his advances. There was only a few girls that he liked, and he would make it a point to be alone with us as much as he could. Some of them liked it. I didn't. He liked the fact that I didn't like it, and he would hound me every day, going further and further with me, and what he tried. One day he cornered me into the walk-in cooler and grabbed me from behind. He was trying his hardest to get me to have sex with him, and when I refused, it enraged him, and he started trying to take it from me by force. I fought back, but he was a lot bigger than I was. As he was yanking my pants down, I remember really praying for the first time, "God, please save me." And right as I said this, someone happened to walk into the cooler. It was one of my sisters. Jay dropped me, pulled his pants up and walked out screaming. I caught Emily with the cell phone in the walk-in, and I was put on discipline for 2 months. The longest I have ever heard of anyone being put on discipline for. He told the pastors he caught me trying to call my boyfriend, and I didn't even have a boyfriend going in. And I tried to tell them that he attacked me, showed them the bruises on my back and arms, but they said I was trying to get out of my punishment. All the other girls at the diner were scared and wouldn't say anything for fear of punishment. He requested I stay on at the diner during my discipline because I was so good in the kitchens, and they allowed it. He must have felt sorry for me for what he did, because he took it easy on me for a while I was there. He started telling me that he was in love with me, in an attempt to woo me. I don't know. Several girls had left at this point, all telling the higher-ups about Jay and his attacks, but they all dismissed all the allegations. I was stranded in Arkansas, 500 miles away from home with no money and no way of getting back. I couldn't go to the police because the sheriff's wife worked for the ministry, and she told him that the girls invented sexual abuse stories to get out of discipline. I was in hell. I started praying in earnest that something would be done about the situation, and it did. A girl came into the program whose parents were massive donors to the ministry. They gave the ministry about $100,000 a year. So naturally, she was given the cushy grill job almost immediately. He tried putting his hands down her pants, and she immediately threatened to tell her parents. That got the pastor's attention, and he was fired. They shut down the grill as well, and I was delivered from Jay at last. They decided to open up another centre in the city that I'm from, and in my 10th month, I was sent back home. I was under the direction of a different pastor and his wife, and they were genuinely good people. And once I was there, I was able to actually do a lot of growing spiritually. I graduated after 14 months in 2011, and went on living in the real world again. I got together with my husband, and we have a 4-month-old son now. The experience I went through at that place was the single most influential situation I have ever been through in my life. It sounds like a horrible place, but the struggles I went through in there helped to make me a solid person today. It molded the way I look at life. I take nothing for granted, and I wake up with joy. There are so many horrific things about that place, but I think I'm done for now. Be wary of cults. I worked for a cult. It was a private school for rich kids who had addictions. There was a dynamic leader who had an inner circle of young boys who he doted on. The school itself was somewhat abusive. Unrestrained staff like myself administering meds when I started, and I was able to administer PRN Thorazine. As a staff member, I had to live like the students, adhere to the same rules and regulations. Then they worked to distance me from my family, telling me that I had an addiction, which I didn't, and that it was dangerous for me to use my time off work to see my family. I walked away after a few weeks, because I thought I was too weak to work there. Then I went back and realized what a terrible place it was, and finally left, with a brand new eating disorder I had managed to avoid during my adolescence. The school shut down eventually due to lawsuits from parents. The former students have a Facebook page, and from what I can tell, many struggle with the systematic abuse they experienced. The leader has since died, and turned out all his degrees and awards were faked. It taught me a lot about safety and service for vulnerable people. The scariest moment was the student who was actively psychotic and should have been in a lockdown facility, but who was still with us. I was told to restrain him, even though he wasn't fighting. He was on a hunger strike and refused to leave the building for a meeting. I had to carry him to the meeting and restrained him the whole time.